All right. So as you have hopefully seen in your bulletin, the scripture we're going to be looking at is Ezra 3, 10 through 13. Before I get too far into that, I'm going to kind of just start with a bit of a narrative. Set on a small lake in northern Minnesota, where sat a small but charming, well-kept little fishing resort. Is well known in certain circles for its unusually clear water and diversity of fish species, some reaching trophy size. The accommodations were quaint, very nice, comprised mostly of individual cabins spaced nicely around a larger compound and centered around a small, homey sort of main building that smelled of fresh bread and buzzed with the activity of the resident family. The resort was owned by an elderly widowed woman and run by her older unmarried daughter and her younger married daughter in family. The younger daughter had two sons who spent their childhood summers working and playing on this resort, and both cherished these summers as the high points of their childhoods, although in later discussion, both agreed that Christmas was their favorite time to spend there. As boys do, the brothers grew up and eventually moved away, starting families of their own. The widow's younger daughter likewise moved on with her husband, and the eldest mother and the daughter eventually, after working the resort for some years, sold it on. All cherished the memories of their years together at the resort. They often reminisced about the good old days with each other and told the stories to their the children of the two brothers. As time went on, the family grew, both in number and in separation. Children and their children moved away to various parts of the country, pursuing school, careers, relationships, retirement opportunities. They rarely saw each other, and even then, hardly ever together as a larger family. One unusually cold winter, the widow passed away. Her eldest daughter, who had never married and had become the primary caretaker of the widow, followed only a month after. The memorial service was the first time in years the remaining family members had been together. They expressed their condolences as well as their great regret that they had grown so far apart and rarely saw one another. Upon returning home, the middlemost of the widow's great-grandchildren, who had taken up a vocation in real estate, sat in a quiet moment, recalling the stories he had grown up with of the old fishing resort and the family's togetherness. On a whim, he decided to look up the old resort property and just wondering what had become of it. To his surprise, he found it vacant and for sale at an incredibly attractive price. Curious, he called the responsible agency to inquire and then contacted his siblings and cousins. Several of them, after some excited discussion, agreed to all go in together and purchase the property. They had hoped to use it as a family getaway and a gathering place where they might reconnect and reclaim some of their former cohesion, possibly even restarting a family business. However, they kept it a secret from the two now old brothers and their mother. The following summer, they surprised their parents and grandparents with a family reunion and a vacation to the old resort. Upon arrival, the respective family units poured out of their vehicles and excitedly embraced. They hurried around the property, enthusiastically exploring the compound. For most of them, it was the first time they had ever laid eyes on it. These family members couldn't help but dream of the possibilities, laugh in their joy at having this time in this place together. The two brothers and the widow's youngest daughter had not laid eyes on it in almost 50 years. And while their children and grandchildren excitedly ran around the compound, chattered with each other at the place's potentials, the widow's daughter and her sons embraced with tearful eyes. You see, the cabins were mostly dilapidated and had not been well maintained. The main building was almost wholly caved in. The grounds were overgrown, and worst of all, due to a shift in the area's water drainage, the lake was now only a specter of its former glory, somewhat murky, banks mostly choked with weeds, and less than 2/3 of its former volume. Most of the thriving fish population had been severely reduced, and none of the trophy specimens still roamed its waters. They were overwhelmed by the condition of the place and the pain of loss. Still, There was a small dock and a clear spot on the shore where a rowboat was tied, and several of the younger children were already excitedly pushing it out into the open water, splashing and screaming with delight while their grandparents and parents wept. Life has a way of shifting and changing, not always for the better, or so it would seem depending on your perspective. Last week we talked about the possibility of what the church might be looking like here in the U.S. In the future. And we discussed sort of alternative options for what might happen if we don't reconnect our former past and preeminence in our society, and what it might look like if things were sort of less than we were used to, at least in outward appearance. And as I said, we were going to discuss in subsequent weeks just elements of that and things that we might have to consider as we looked at moving forward as a church. Now, with any situation where circumstances may or may not be tough, but in potential tough, one of the first things that you need to do is admit and embrace where you're at, right? Whether that is personal recovery or an issue that you're dealing with, or any sort of situation where moving forward in difficulty or improvement is necessary, the starting place is realizing where you're at. That might seem very obvious, but sometimes it's the hardest part of the process, right? And at the very least, the starting point of it. The reality is, moving forward, if things need improvement, sometimes the first step is deconstruction. And for us as a North American church, and even here at Chico Alliance Church, this is often the part that is the hardest process, right? Because before things get better, it seems like they get worse at first. And oftentimes when we're in a place of really embracing where we're at, one of the things that we need to embrace is that deconstruction process. That things may get a little bit worse before they get better. I don't know what that's going to look like for us here in the West, and particularly in American Christianity, but I think there's a level of just whatever comes, we have to embrace it. And for that rebuilding and reconstruction point to take place. Now, we can probably in many ways, or will be able to empathize with what we see in Ezra 3:10 through 13. Now, turning there, we see the Israelites in a place where they are returning to the promised land. And they're in a place of rebuilding after what has been for them certainly a deconstruction process for them as a nation. Literally, their temple has been destroyed and deconstructed by an overpowering country, the Babylonians in this case. The Babylonians themselves were taken over, and under new leadership, they were allowed to return. In the books, we see the records of this in Ezra and Nehemiah. And in Ezra, we see a rebuilding process starting to take place, and they start with the temple and temple compound after a group of exiles are moved back to Israel. And we see starting in verse 10 there, when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments with trumpets and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their place to praise the Lord as prescribed by David, king of Israel, with praise and thanksgiving as they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love towards Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sounds of the shouts of joy from the sounds of weeping, because the peoples made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. So what does any of that have to do in my opening story with embracing the reality of where we're at? Well, there's probably going to be a couple of different perspectives coming at this that we're going to have to brace almost simultaneously. First thing to embrace is change itself. And there's going to be a couple of perspectives probably in embracing that change that we're going to have to navigate together as a church here at Chico Alliance, and I think as a greater church in America. The first thing, though, is just recognizing the change of where we're at. So we kind of jumped ahead. We had a pretty big fast forward here, because where we left off in Jeremiah last week, we have the Israelites in a position where they're just going into exile, right? They're just at a point where they're realizing things are going to be drastically different as we move forward. And they've had a long time of exile, about 70 years in Babylon, and now they get the opportunity from that to rebuild. And the difficulty is, if you look in the earlier parts of these books, in Ezra and Nehemiah, one of the toughest things that they had to start with was even embracing the opportunity to move back, because many of them had gotten very comfortable in the way things had changed. A lot of them had become prosperous there in what was Babylon and now Assyria, and they had carved out a niche for themselves. And now they have this opportunity, and God's sort of calling them to move back, and the question is, am I going to do it? Or am I going to stay here with what's become comfortable? Now, oftentimes we kind of hear about this, like in the sense, if you're in a warm bath and over time it grows lukewarm, it's not real comfortable, but it's more uncomfortable to get out, right? Sort of face the cold water. I was having this experience just last night, as I was trying to conserve some cold water, so there'd be a little, or warm water, so there'd be a little bit left for my wife after she came in after me, and we'd also previously bathed the boys. So I'm kind of here in this lukewarm shower, and it's not terrible, it's not great, but I don't want to get out. I don't want to step out and face the cold tile and the cold air, and the process of getting there's that initial shock, right? So this is where we see them here. And I feel in some ways we're probably going to be able to relate to that. We are, as much as we may not like the direction that things have gone in many ways in our country, or even maybe here in this church, it's hard to face that initial shock of change, of something different, right? But to get there, we've got to realize this is the reality of where we're at. We've got to feel like, embrace the fact that this is not as comfortable as things were. It's not ideal. It's not what I like. And also, it's probably not going to just get better if I don't do anything about it. Eventually, that warm water is just going to totally run out, and I'm going to be in a cold shower, and that's not where I want to be. And even looking for these guys here, they're in Babylon. Babylon's been taken over. They don't know how long they've got in any circumstance. It's just the one that they're in immediately is not so bad. But if they go back, they've got to start this rebuilding process, and it's going to be a lot different than what they have now. So you have a group of them that does that. And so that's kind of the first point, is we got to sort of sit in reflection. Where are we? What are we embracing? Are we in a position that is going to maintain a long time? Or if we do nothing about it, is it going to get worse eventually? And what does it look like for us to move forward? Now, as we do that, there's a couple of different positions that we're going to probably encounter here. It being easier to stay in Babylon, both of them are going to have their own pitfalls. And it's going to take a little bit of coming together on both of them to be, I think, able to move forward in a way that's going to be the most beneficial. The first hindrance to moving on, to really embracing, is reflected also in our passage here, and that's the one of sort of denial, right? And you sort of wonder at this position that the Israelites are in. All of a sudden, they're in this position that should, in many ways, be, hey, great, we're back. There's a level of restoration here. We're rebuilding the temple. And what you see is a response by most of one generation here that is seeing what was going on before and what they used to have, what they came out of, and that's one of profound grief. And one wonders, why at this point are they experiencing that grief? And just to take an aside really quick, I want to see, you have what we see as sort of a fresh or maybe ignorant joy, and then what in the older generation is probably a depth of grief, right? Because they have all of this history of experience, and they're juxtaposing this position that they're under to that past history. Neither response, do I think, is wrong. I want to just say that right up front. It's easy to, depending on the perspective, if you're from a younger, fresher generation, you might be looking at this going, these old sticks in the mud. here we are in this position where we can finally move forward. We're finally in restoration. We're ready to do it. We're gung-ho. We're all excited about it. And instead of being on board, you've got this whole group of people that's just weeping and sort of dragging the attitude of the whole thing down. And instead of being excited and on board, they're just in sorrow. And it might be easy to look at that and be like, kind of get yourself together. Yeah, things were hard there for a while, but we're moving forward. Let's just get on board and do it, right? Or you're from that perspective where you saw what things were like in the past, really enjoyed that, experienced the blessings of that, had the fullness of that. Together, as a nation in this case, we're part of that building and just construction process, right? And are thinking, yeah, I know you guys are really excited, but this is not what we have. I know you're all excited, but calm down, look what happened. Or just don't have the energy to move forward in the way that you did before. You were part of building things and bringing it up, and it's like, now that's all gone, and you're just tired. And I don't think, what's interesting is you go through this narrative and you just have the description of both, right? And there's no comment by the author to qualify either one, to say these are the pros and the cons, or this is where they were wrong and this group should have been like this, because I think both were appropriate responses to where they were at. Both were two sets of people, sort of even together as a nation, really embracing the reality of where they're at. Now, would it have been better if this grieving process had taken place, at a different point? Maybe, but it has to take place somewhere, right? And maybe without being intentional about it, it does take place at a point where, it seems maybe a little bit unplaced. I don't know, but we don't have a comment here in Scripture where he says, well, these guys were right or wrong. It's just a reality of where they were at. And both, in a sense, are embraced, and I think both had to be processed and gone through for them to move forward as a history. So, having said that, kind of backing up and forwarding back to the point, to the first hindrance, because I think there's pros and cons to both, right? Neither one is right or wrong, but both of them are going to come with their own sets of pros and cons. So, what are the pros and cons of that sense of grief, that grieving process? And what are the pros going to be? So, the first, I think, pro, and probably the biggest one, is being in a sense of denial, right? That's the first major stumbling block to being able to move forward constructively and appropriately from that one perspective. And what do we get when we happen? One, and basically what it looks like is just staying in the shower. This is good enough. This is where I'm at. It may not be where I want to be, but this is where I'm at. And I'm just, I choose not to think about that this is going to get worse, and I just stay where I'm at right here. Now, of course, we want to be present in the moment, right? A whole part of this is being present in the moment constructively. But there's a way of being present in the moment that is not constructive. And that's where we call it navel gazing, where I'm just kind of staring at the situation where I'm at. I'm kind of sucked inside this, and this is where I'm going to be at, and I'm choosing to stay here, maybe lamenting the good old days or whatever. And that's where I'm going to hang out. That's not constructive grief. That's denial. And maybe I recognize that the situation isn't that great, but I'm just denying that there's anywhere better or whatever to go from here. The problem is there's often a time limit, right? There's only so long that I get to hang out in that place, for good or for worse, before something gets worse, before something changes, or I just flat run out of time. We've all got a certain lifespan, and we've all have a choice on how we're going to use it. And no matter how good or bad things were in the future, like we saw in Jeremiah 29 last week, there's always a hope and a plan that God has for us. There's something more, or at least something to move into. So if we just hang out there, we just choose to not embrace the reality of the situation because we're frustrated about it, we don't think it is what it should be, or for whatever reason, that's going to be where we stay until things time out. And in the end, is that we're really where we want to be? I don't know. I don't think so, though. So what does it take to get beyond that? We're going to get to that in a second. But we're going to first kind of look at what's the other side. What's the sort of the con of the other side? And I call this sort of ignorant joy. And I don't want to use the ignorant in a total negative sense. It's just the lack of experience of anything different, right? And it's usually easy to be very excited about something when we're moving into something, and this is sort of our experience of it, right? Things haven't been that great. We get to move forward and we're really excited about it, and that's great. And that's good, but oftentimes there's not a depth of experience with that, right? So the pitfalls tend to be, we just get excited and we plow forward into something, and then we tend to stumble over the first roadblock that pops up, and then we kind of get our bubble bursted, and that's the end of that, right? And it's just sort of excitement, I say, without the depth of experience. And I feel like it's possible to have both, but both are, again, is going to have its own pros and cons. We're going to trip over it. And but to move forward, I think we're going to have to embrace both the pitfalls of both and also the benefits of both. So moving forward, then, what are the positives of both? So I kind of lost oh my goodness, I don't think. You know what? Something happened when I printed this out this morning and I lost the end of my notes. That's a total bummer. That's where my notes stop. All right. We're living it from here on out. Buckle up, everyone. To be totally honest, I was a little bit frustrated with this sermon anyway. I'm bored with it. And I'm not 100% sure why that is. I was really excited about it going into it. And maybe I should just back up a moment and kind of retrace the heart of where I'm at with this. I think moving forward, like I said, we've got this sort of double experience that we're going to be experiencing. I think we're going to have an experience of a generation that has enjoyed the benefits of where we've been at in Christianity. And I feel like there's a sense of just frustration with where we're at, almost like a gridlock. It's not what we wanted. We don't fully have the energy to move forward. We're tired, we're worn out, and we're feeling like this is it. This is what we've come to as a country. And if things don't get better real soon, whatever. And I see this in Ezra as I'm looking at it. Just this generation that maybe is excited about moving back. They're doing it because they think they should. But as they're reconstructing this temple, they're just sad. And there's a grieving that needs to take place there. And I think unless we do that effectively, appropriately, and properly, we're just going to get stuck there. And so I spent a little bit of time looking up what appropriate grief looks like. And a couple of the things, so backing up a second, we also know the stages of grief, right? We've heard a lot about that. There's denial was that first one, which is kind of where I was going at initially. It's just sort of, you got your head down and you're not acknowledging that things are changing, and it's just, I'm not ready to process all of this. And so this is just where it is, and we kind of hang out there. It's not always intentional. It's just the reality of we have to function, right? And I think that's where we've been for a long time as a North American church. We've been in function mode, and we've not wanted to deviate or embrace the past or the future, because we don't fully know how to. We don't know what it looks like. We're a little bit scared of it, especially what might be coming down the pipe. And it's really easier to focus on the here and now. So anger is one of those big ones, right? There's bargaining. Well, maybe we can do this, and then things are going to change. We'll have an old-fashioned revival like the way we've seen it in the past. I think there will be a revival. I just think it's going to look different than some of our history books and the history of the church in North America and Western Europe have looked. I think it'll be real. I think it'll be heartfelt. I think God will be moving and Christianity will be thriving in a sense, but it just might not look like what it did in those circumstances. For the building generation and for the baby boomers, even, who were kind of the children of that generation, who frankly, because things were so good, probably grew a little apathetic. Not us here in this church, of course, but at large. And honestly, a lot of my generation has left the church. Something that I've said before, a lot of the we had a thriving youth group. We didn't have a huge church growing up, but we had kind of a smaller group, but it was great. We just group of excited, heartfelt believers. We were that fresh joy, that ignorant joy in a sense. And in our parents' generation, there just was something missing maybe. And I don't say that to be accusative. I just say that to be frank. We heard a lot of the theory of church and Christianity, but we didn't always see the fruit, if that made sense. We saw middle-class Americans who were living the American dream or weren't and were frustrated about it, one or the other. We're doing pretty good for the most part, especially if we're in the middle class. And life just sort of was what it was. We were all Christians and it was America, but things started to shift and started to change, right? And to be totally honest, most of the people that I grew up with in that thriving youth group and generation are not churchgoers anymore, don't profess any kind of faith. There's a level of sympathy with what they grew up with, a level of, yeah, there's probably some kind of God out there. There's some level of truth here, at least maybe the morals were good and we should hold on to those. But as far as like a thriving relationship with God, that just doesn't exist. And some of that is because we didn't see it modeled for us. Again, that's not, it's hard to just say that without it being an accusation. And I guess it is, but look where we took that. We chose to abandon it. We sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and that's on us. And you see a mixture kind of this, I think, in the wrestling match of whether to go back to Israel, to sort of rebuild the foundation. Look where that got us in the past, right? We have this past generation that just really kind of screwed things up. And I know that's being very negative, and I don't say that just to be negative, or was missing something. And at least over here, we kind of have a life carved out for us, and it's not back there where we were. And we could just hang out there. And so you've got the ones that have experienced it and have also experienced some judgment or experienced a gravitation away from what's been. And but the end results of both standpoints are kind of the same, right? Let's just sort of hang out here, not even in second best, in captivity. Just hang out here and say good enough. But I think God wants more for us than that. And the hump that we have to get over is embracing that there is something more. Now, for those of us that have been part of that building generation, that saw sort of the earlier glory of things, of what we had here in North America, and enjoying the church at center stage in a lot of ways, and sort of a mover and shaker in society, is that fresh start isn't going to quite look like what we had before. In this case, you've got the corners and the foundations of the temple built. And this new generation is just super excited about it. Hey, all right, we're moving forward. We sort of felt like we had the rug poured out from under us, but we got to start here, and that's super exciting. And I think the harder thing for the one generation to do, maybe, and maybe I'm wrong, is going to be to get on board with that and be excited. But the first thing you have to do, I think, is to grieve constructively. So now we're circling back around to maybe where my original point was at. And looking at how you grieve constructively, it's one, you have to be intentional about it. If you're not being intentional about it, it just doesn't happen. You tend to get stuck in that navel gazing, or life is just where it's at or where it's going to be, and that's just too bad, right? We tried, things didn't work out. Oh well, we sort of ride it on out until the end of things, whatever that looks like. Either Jesus comes back, or the next generation gets it together and rebuilds and starts some kind of revival, or not. And things just time out, and I'm gone, and then I'm in heaven, and then who cares, right? At that point, I'm with Jesus. And yeah, I make that all sound real cavalier maybe, or dour, and that's not our attitude, but in the end, I think what we have to look at is our actions, right? That's going to show where our real attitude is at. and where we're moving and what we're doing. And so one way maybe to get out of that is to take some time to constructively grieve. Now, back to this embracing sense, what do you see here? In the situation, you see a bunch of folks that their hearts are just broken. Yeah, it's exciting that they're moving on, but there's a realization of how we got to be where we are. You know, there's a sadness, there's a loss there. My opening story, you sort of have the generations of that old resort, just embracing the sorrow of the reality of, man, we really miss what we had. And they're taking the time to embrace each other, the situation, and just grieve a little bit. And however we move forward, I think it's fair that we get to do that. One of the suggestions that I saw by different psychologists who specialize in grief was to make a time to reflect and to grieve. Because if you don't do that properly, you tend to kind of get stuck or jaded emotionally. I've seen this on lots of ends of the spectrum. We kind of all know families where something tragic happens, and you've got the individuals in that family, say a loved one passes away, that just really enter into it and grieve the process, right? And they weep and they mourn, and you don't ever just really move on, or the pain never fully goes away. But there's a significant process of entering into it and allowing that to move you, right? And those that do that, we see they tend to get through it in a bit healthier fashion, don't they? They're able to embrace it better. They're able to embrace the new reality of things more fully because they fully embrace the reality of the past and the reality of the loss. And we also know the individuals that don't do that. They never really grieve. And they always seem to be carrying a chip on their shoulder, don't they? It's just something that they just keep stumbling over. And that's what I want to kind of avoid in our church here moving forward. I feel like as a greater church in America that we want to avoid as well, right? We want to avoid just getting stuck and never quite getting over that hump and that hurdle. To summarize it, I think I've sort of wandered my way around to my main point there. And the real shame is that if we don't, we have a generation that either just doesn't know any better, right? This is just what we've grown up with. This, the reality of, stories about a relationship with God, really, but that's just something that we used to believe in the past. And what we really need to embrace is sort of trundling through where we're at as a present. We don't know any better because there are rich, deep histories here. We do have the depth of that building generation who knows what it's like to follow Jesus. Maybe in the specifics of their context, but they know it's possible and they've done it, they've experienced it firsthand. Maybe they did it quietly in a way that we misinterpreted in our generation and didn't see the depth that was there, or experienced it even secondhand from their parents, or however that worked out. I remember when I was in high school, I was small, I got picked on a lot, and I just decided that's going to change. And so I joined the football team and I joined the wrestling team. I was a little guy, but I was quick, and so I kind of carved out my niche in football, but it's just like I am so sick of being awkward physically, like I have to do something to change it. And so my sophomore year actually, so I'd already been in high school a year, I just joined the football team and then later the wrestling team. Football I was terrible at, for the very least, for that first year that I played it. But I wanted to be a part of the collective, right? So our team in football had taken state a couple of times in a year, and they just kind of have this powerhouse. They were sort of the Alaska football powerhouse, the state champs, the defending champs. We had a really good coach and just this an amazing amount of talent. We had some like All-American high school guys and stuff on the team. And all of us young guys in high school wanted a piece of that glory. And our team had a policy as such where they didn't cut anybody, right? So what they would do is they would take the cream of the crop and they would put them in the varsity team. And then they would take their up-and-comers and put them in the junior varsity team. and then everybody else they would put on what they called C team, right? And that was Jered's team, the C team. We literally had to transport our C team on 2 buses. So we would show up to our games, and this huge team would pile off of these 2 full-size buses. And man, there was an intimidation factor in that until we started playing. We all wanted a piece of the glory, but not all of us wanted to do the work to get to that part. We just wanted to be on the team, right? Wear our jersey on game day and walk around like hotshots. But so much of us are just terrified of really playing football. And we'd show up to practice when we do our things, and we really just, I would say easily 2/3 of us just really didn't put in the work to do anything other than really the work to do anything. But we were there. We were a part of the team, right? And we just, part of that, I think, is we didn't get to see, because of our removal from, especially the varsity guys, we didn't really see they kind of kept us like in a separate place. Varsity team, I don't even think practiced at our school. They just carted them off somewhere else. Part of the downside of that was these guys kind of lived in their own little bubble, and we had our own little bubble over here. And you didn't get to see that or break out of it until you showed some merit. And then they would, literally, you'd show up to practice one day, and one guy that had shown some promise at the last game would be gone. Now they were on JV team. They'd made it, right? They'd sort of been raptured out of the C team. And the rest of us just trundled along. And it was really cool in a lot of ways, but it really stunk in a lot of ways, because you just didn't have access to that whole other generation, to that building generation. Well, guess what happened within 3 years? All of us C-teamers all of a sudden were varsity. Not because we were any good, because there weren't any other options. We didn't get to practice with those other guys. We didn't get to see those other guys. And there was something missed in the passing down of the torch. Same thing when I joined the wrestling team. Even more so than our football team, our wrestling team was a total powerhouse. We'd taken regions, I think, like 26 years in a row, and just taken state a bunch of times. And you had there were just guys getting drafted out of our wrestling team on full scholarships into the Midwest to be wrestlers. I don't know, for whatever reason, our coach was just awesome. Same thing, they didn't cut anybody. Everybody got to be a part of the team. But the varsity guys had their special locker room. They had their special thing. They worked out on their own program. And the exact same thing happened. By the time I got up into the higher ranks of things and started to show some real promise and potential, I dislocated a couple of ribs, and that puts a dampening on a wrestling career. And God kind of moved me into some other things, but the same thing happened. Eventually, the whole thing died out. And the problem was that other generation never totally passed on the torch. They kind of had their own thing. They did their work, and they graduated out, and they were gone. And the rest of us were just sort of left. We wanted some of that glory, but we did not get to see firsthand. We were not brought into what really the work and the ethic of what it took to get there in the first place. Does that make sense? And I think we might experience some of that here in the Christian church. We sort of had the building, that worker generation, the boomers who sort of had that handed to them, and then my generation who really, in many ways, maybe doesn't have that torch. They don't have that. We all want to move forward and rebuild, but we honestly weren't part of that generation that got there and built it in the first place. And so our experience is from the generation that just sort of has that handed down to them. And really at this point, there's not much to hand to us. And so when God does enact, I think, a sense of that revival, a sense of we want something more, and we start to build the corner of the stones of a foundation, we might get really excited about it, but it doesn't look like what it did before. It's a smaller temple, not as glorious. But the neat thing is when they finished building this temple, however humble it might be, who fills it? The same God who filled the bigger gilded one. And we've got to start somewhere, don't we? And so this is kind of the challenge that I pose to us. One, have we grieved? It's okay. It's not unchristian. It's not discounting what God has done in our lives. In some ways, it's really fully embracing it and feeling the real sorrow. In grief, and I think one of the things that, especially in these kind of situations that blocks it, is there's some things I have to own to really fully enter into that grief, right? I said grace accidentally there, kind of fortuitously, because you don't experience grace unless there's a level of grief, I think, but one precedes the other. I love, I had it in my latter parts of my notes. May even be in this one. I know it's in 2 Corinthians, but I can't remember the exact reference, but it says that godly sorrow leads to repentance and to life, right? Where worldly sorrow leads to death. And what's the difference between the two? Well, one, God is in the one, but the one is also focused and motivated in God. It's a productive sorrow, right? It's a sorrow that is processing through something. If we haven't done that, maybe we need to take some intentional time to do that. Maybe I need to go back to God and reflect, is there something that I'm not wanting to face here? Is there a grief that I just need to embrace and enter into? Intentional grief. A lot of the secular psychologists even say, pick a time and a place. If you don't want it to be messy and all over every other part of your daily life, where you're going to get to come back and you're going to get to do that. You're going to get to sit down with your memories and the things that you cherish, and you're going to just get to grieve them. Now, on the flip side of that, it's my generation, are we willing to build? Are we willing to trust God in ways that we haven't had to before because we've just been going with the flow? One, we're going to have to stop blaming previous generations for where we're at, because God is still calling us back in and calling us to rebuild, isn't he? It may not be what we experienced or saw before, but it's a starting place somewhere, and we have to start there. Otherwise, nothing happens. And are we willing to enter into that and be joyful about it? Are we willing to embrace the grieving of the past generation? And instead of judging, enter into that with them and embrace that with them. Is the older generation willing to embrace the joy and the excitement in the midst of sorrow? I tell that opening story because I feel like it just sort of contemporizes what's going on in this experience in Ezra 3, that both end process. The both legitimate joy and the excitement at the prospect of even getting to rebuild. I think, again, like I said, there will be revival in this country, even if Christianity doesn't enjoy all the freedoms that it did before, and the prominence and the embracing by the society and whatever. It might be a quiet revival. By that, I just mean something that's a subcurrent to our society rather than the overarching current of it, if that makes sense. But to get there, we have to start at the starting point. For those of us in the building generation, we don't get to fast forward to the glory part. And for those in the previous generation, we've got to embrace that starting point, and we don't get to just start maybe where we even left off. And so in lieu of rambling any further up here, that's kind of at the heart of what I was trying to get at. I apologize for not being more diligent at making sure I had all of my notes printed off. It might have been a good thing. For some reason, I was just struggling with this one. And, whatever. We need to stand up here and bloviate about the details of why that might have been or might not have been. But still, that's at least the heart that I'm trying to communicate is just this starting point. And I know for me, it's frustrated in the midst of COVID and everything else, even as a pastor, getting all excited, man, there's something I'd like to do, but COVID. And, and even the services and, everything right now is not quite our ideal, is it? But it is something. And here we are getting to, in a sense, rebuild the temple. And I like that. Later Nehemiah rebuilds the walls, right? Sort of the outward structure of things. It's not where we're going to start. We've talked about that. We're starting here at the temple. And the significance of that, before they even put in a cornerstone for the temple, they started with the altar. If you look at that at the previous verses right before this one, where they're doing the temple, they start with an altar, a place of sacrifice. And they were sacrificing lambs and goats and bulls. But the things that we sacrifice on the altar in our starting place are things like pride, fear, apathy, ignorance, hope founded in the wrong place, inappropriate ways of coping with where things are at. There's all kinds of things, but you start at that place. That's the place of sacrifice. And that works itself all the way up into the construction of the Holy of Holies, right? Place where God dwells. And I think there's a progression there. You move from that place of sacrifice to a place of worship to a place of just the settled restedness of God's glory. Right down at the heart and the hearts of things. And I've always liked the temple and the tabernacle analogy. I've always liked that when Jesus was crucified, that veil that separated God's presence from us was torn. And I feel like each of us kind of is a little temple and tabernacle walking around, right? And you've got those different places of worship, place of sacrifice, the place of just community, and that deep place of just God's presence at the core, right? Where the most profound worship takes place. A place where just God rests. And as we know and experience God's work and his grace for us, that gets torn, and that's where we live out of. That's where we hang out. And that happens in prosperity, and that happens in living in less. I love Paul's verse in Philippians. I can live in plenty, and I can live without. I've learned the secret of both. And God allows them to do both. Both have their pitfalls, right? So that's where we're at. I'm going to go ahead and just wind it down there without a great transition into the end. As has been a custom that I'm trying to build here, I'm going to go ahead and just release us with a prayer and a blessing. And we'll go from there. As you walk into both the joys and the sorrow of the journey of faith, this side of eternity, may God meet you there. As you fully embrace in a way that draws you in to your relationship with God and with your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. May God light a path for you that facilitates that growth and that journey. Not neglecting either the joys or the sorrows, but fully embracing both in a way that's constructive. And in doing this, may you find peace. May you find community. May you find hope in a future. To God be the glory. great things he has done, and great things he is yet to do. Amen.
Amen.